Welcome to the Creating Conditions podcast, brought to you by the American Indian Student Achievement Team at the Montana Office of Public Instruction, where we strive to create the conditions necessary for American Indian students and all students to reach their educational and lifelong goals. Creating Conditions emphasizes the proactive effort of shaping an environment to facilitate a desired outcome. It involves recognizing that success often depends on more than just effort. It also depends on the surrounding circumstances. Our team believes all Montanans stand to benefit from the Indigenous knowledge that persists today. We are dedicated to serving all students through the creation and implementation of Indigenous whole child supports. No matter where you work or what populations of students you serve, we are so glad you are checking out our podcast because all students attend school as whole people and whole learners.
All right, welcome and thank you for tuning into the Creating Conditions podcast. My name is Michelle Hinson. I work as a Tribal Student Achievement Specialist at the Office of Public Instruction.
And I'm Michelle's counterpart at the OPI as a Tribal Student Achievement Specialist, and I'm a member of the Bazaliga Nation. My name is Crystal Hickman in this world, and at home, my name is Vijay Galoish, which means watches the buffalo go by. I'm really happy you're here. Thank you. Thank you for coming and listening to our conversation.
And in this episode, we're going to center around school attendance and strategies for creating positive connections to school in a way that will positively influence attendance. And we have two guests joining us today. And so I'm hoping they can introduce themselves. Tammy, do you want to go first and then we'll kick it over to Dylan?
Sure. We are so glad to be here. Thank you so much for having us. I am Tammy Tolleson, and I am a clinical faculty at the University of Montana in the College of Education for the Phyllis J. Washington Center for the Advancement of Positive Education, or what we call CAPE.
And I am Dylan Wright, and I am the community liaison for the Phyllis J. Washington Center for the Advancement of Positive Education, or CAPE. And I am thrilled to be here also to get to talk with you all. This is so fun.
Well, thanks for being here. We're really glad to have you. And we want to provide us a little bit of background information about why we chose to focus on attendance and focus on attachment. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, school attendance across the nation has greatly decreased. Chronic absenteeism, which is defined as a student missing 10% or more of school, peaked in the United States as a nation between 2021 and 2022, with 31% of students being defined as chronically absent. And just as a point of reference, in Montana, the most recent data we have from the 2024-25 school year, we show that approximately 66% of Native students were chronically absent. And we know that as a whole, for as long as we've been tracking data, Native students tend to have a lower rate of attendance compared to non-Native students, but we also know that there's a lot more barriers and challenges, or maybe some unique barriers and challenges to Native students attending school. And I just want to start with one example to kind of shed some light on what we mean by that. And so recently we had some students come on a panel to share some students' perspectives to help a task force in some decision making that was happening. And one of the students, when posed the question, what is the greatest challenge for you when it comes to school, she described just getting to school. And she just happens to attend a school that involves she's required to drive around 30 minutes one way every day. And we know that her story is not unique. We know, especially for students in rural parts of the state, whether they're on reservation or off reservation, transportation is a challenge. And we also, though, want to focus in on some of those other unique challenges that Indigenous students face, outside of maybe those structural barriers and just distance that they may have to travel. And we want to focus this podcast episode and this episode in particular around this idea of attachment and what can we do to create schools that are spaces where Native students have that sense of community and have that that attached feeling and sense of attachment to school, positive attachment to school. And so as we get ready to frame this out a bit more, I'm hoping, Crystal, can you share more about attendance, maybe those barriers that we kind of touched on before, but also why connection to school is important, especially for Indigenous students, and maybe share from that Indigenous lens what attachment looks like.
I think when we talk about Indigenous student attendance in schools, it's really usually framed as a numbers problem. Absences, tardies, percentages, accountability. But for many Indigenous communities, tribal communities, attendance isn't really about numbers. It's about relationships. And I think that kind of gets at the very core of, I guess, touching on or relating to attachment and attachment theory. But when we shift the conversation from compliance to connection, the story starts to look a little bit different. So a lot of public school settings, it's treated as an individual responsibility. Attendance, is treated as an individual responsibility. If a student's not showing up, the assumption is that they're disengaged, unmotivated, or they just really don't care. But the Indigenous worldview, from where I'm coming from, tends to be relational at its core. We center connection to our families, communities, to our land, to our ancestors, to our culture. These are not just things we're saying. These are actual realities in our life. My daughter, the 21-year-old, is she's always talking about touching grass, putting her feet on grass, and I love that. That's such a relational way of thinking about the earth, because we are related to the earth. We are related to the world around us, and place means something to every one of us. So identity, when we think about our Indigenous identity, it's our Indigenous identity isn't built around independence. It's really about our responsibility and obligations to one another. And that difference really matters when you're talking about attendance. So just a quick example is a student might miss school because they're caring for siblings, or they're responsible for attending or being a part of a ceremony, or they're supporting a family while grieving or doing the grieving process. From a dominant school lens, that's poor attendance. But from a relational worldview, that's fulfilling an obligation. But just bringing it back to relationships, bringing things back to our relational core. When I think about our kiddos stepping into the school system, into the school building, it's not just that they're stepping into a learning environment. I mean, that would be the vision from a Western standpoint. From an Indigenous lens, they're stepping out of their support systems. They're stepping out of what they understand. Relationship isn't necessarily a thing that we do. It's not an add-on. It is at the core. It's the foundation. It permeates everything that we do. It is the point from which all thought begins. Everything begins with relationship. And I know sometimes when I talk about that, people think it's a little hokey, but there's this really interesting researcher out there. His name is Dr. Matthew Lieberman, and he wrote a book called Social. And he is a professor at UCLA. I'm pretty sure he's a Harvard PhD, but he has done a lot of work with functional resonance, fMRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Sorry, I had to think that one out. And basically what he was looking at is like, what does the brain do at rest? I mean, I think he did a lot of things, but that was one of the things he did, was what does the brain look like at rest? And what he found, and he and his partner and his lab in general found that between analytical tasks, even if that period of time is 1 second, the brain defaults to social thinking. And I think we can kind of intuit that by, as soon as we're done with a task, we're like, okay, what's my kid? What are my kids doing? What's my dog doing? Are we ready to go to the movies tonight? That kind of thing. So we instantly default to social thinking, and I think that really supports the Indigenous worldview and how important relationship is to our kids who are going to school. So that was a long roundabout way of answering your question, but just really thinking about centering safety at the center of our schools is just the most important thing. If our kids can walk in and they feel about their educational settings the way they feel about leaving their auntie's house. I mean, that would be everything, right? I'm not sure I phrased that right, but that they are bringing their culture and their way of relating to one another into the school system. And honestly, our school system is not set up for that. In fact, I always go back to one of the very first lessons I learned, which was don't talk to your neighbor. And it must have been a talker because I heard that a lot. But yeah, so I think we need to consider that kids don't show up to places that don't see them. They don't show up to places where they don't matter.
I would love to take this opportunity to bring our guest speakers in. And so, Tammy, do you want to just share first, kind of reflect on maybe anything you heard, but then also share some of the work that you are doing around the school experience for students and attendance in particular?
Yes. Oh, and thank you both so much for sharing. And Crystal, thank you so much for that perspective, which resonates so much with, I think, also what is needed for so many kids in so many different settings is that understanding that a sense of belonging begins with relationship. And one thing we also do know is that across all the research that's been done around school attendance, and this is not just even in our country, but really around the world, the number one thing that is emphasized that it keeps coming back to is that sense of belonging. So that the first place to start is how do we create a sense of belonging in educational settings? And what that looks like is going to really be unique for that particular community or that culture or the students' experiences with their own caregivers. And so it can really depend, but what is foundational to all of that is relationship. And I love the emphasis, Crystal and Michelle, that both of you have put on the importance of relationship. It is, I do feel like that attendance, and again, this is really true across the globe, attendance issues have become exacerbated since COVID. I think everyone has seen that. And so working to figure out what are we going to do? Because the same things, I think schools have been trying many of the same things that they've done for a long time, and it's not working. And I think if we even looked at the numbers, we would say, hey, this hasn't been working for a while, so we have to think about this in a different way than we have. And Crystal, earlier you said something from compliance to, and then used another C word. What was that? Connections, yes. That is going to be my new motto, from compliance to connection. I love that. And what we know through research too is actually a punitive approach to attendance actually makes attendance worse. So we have to move from that. These are just the rules and you have to follow them to figure out how do we create a sense of belonging through relationships that become places that kids feel so connected to that they want to be there. So when we were working on a statewide attendance research project, we thought about what is it that we haven't considered yet with attendance that might be really important? And there's a lot around this sense of belonging, but we even took it a little bit further to think about relationships, but sort of those foundational relationships, those relationships that are nurturing and that are safe and that help that person or the student grow in ways that are meaningful for them. And so we heard somebody, we got to go to a national attendance, an international actually attendance conference, and heard someone there using attachment theory to really as a lens to view attendance through.
there's so many questions I have around attachment. I'm hoping that maybe I can ask a few of them. But one of the things that I really think about is an attachment theory doesn't really make room a lot of times for the way that our children are raised in our communities. In my own culture, it's customary for the first child to be given to the mother, to the grandmother, and the grandmother will raise that child, his grandmother's grandchild. And then aunties and clan-aunts are all very much part of the raising of that child. But that doesn't really follow the attachment model, the attachment theory model that's necessarily out there for public view anyway. I'm not privy to some of the other things that are happening in research.
Attachment theory was created by John Bowlby in the 1950s, and definitely it was created by a white person really looking at a white culture, and there's so many things it doesn't take into consideration. It also it sort of has kids in one of four categories, and if I've learned anything about kids, it's that they don't really fit into categories. Sometimes categories give us ways of conceptualizing an idea, but I do think when we try and put kids into categories, we really limit our understanding of them. So I think the first thing in looking at attachment theory that's so important is to recognize its limitations and just to take from it the pieces that might be important, which I think so many of us who have worked with kids for a long time might say this is really common sense. And of course, it takes someone like putting it into this fancy theory and people running with it. But Bowlby's basic idea was that the early connections between a child and caregivers, whoever that caregiver was, really impact how they perceive themselves, how they perceive the world, and then how they interact with others throughout their life. And I think one of the reasons this is or might be important for schools to know is that when relationships with your primary caregivers when you were young looked a certain way, and then relationships look really different when you go to school, then it's really unsettling for a kid. And it goes back to what you all were talking about, is that sense of safety, that if this isn't functioning in that way that's most familiar to me and that I feel attached to this way of relating, and now I'm expected to do this differently in ways that don't feel natural for me, well, it would be any of our instincts just to pull back from that. And that's really not pathology at all. That's resilience. So creating that for ourselves. And so part of it is, I think, for any student really understanding what did those basic relationships look like and what created safety. And if a student is not responding in the ways that we would like to see in school, it's sort of going back to that with the curious mind of, so what is that student's experience when they are in this building? What is their experience of relationship, not just with the adults in the building, but the way the rituals and the routines in the building, and are those reflective of the safety of their culture and their place and their caregivers from that early age that they have gotten so familiar with. And also, what about just the building itself? Is the building reflective of my attachments to what I'm used to places being like and how they function and what they look like? And what do the images around this building look like? How does it feel for things to be square and walk in big groups of people down hallways and have certain colors? I mean, I think there's so many nuances that impact that. And also, Michelle, I was so taken last week hearing you really talk about the connection between language and worldview, and how when you're coming into a school with a different language that has a completely different worldview, if we're looking that sort of through an attachment lens, right? Part of resilience says, avoid this because this is not where my primary attachments are. And that sort of rings that bell of this might not be a safe place. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Sure. And thanks for making that connection, Tammy. But absolutely, I think one thing we often fail to recognize is delivering a curriculum in English is not cultural neutral. There is culture, there is worldview wrapped in language, no matter what that language is. But being from that dominant society, we take that for granted sometimes, and we don't realize that there are extra requirements we're placing on students if we are delivering a curriculum that's not aligned with the worldview of students. And so I love how you just, related that to attachment. And I know Crystal and her, Indigenous worldview on attachment. You touched on a couple different things, the building itself, but then also the content. And so taking that really broad lens on attachment, recognizing it as important, but also more broad maybe than just the relational aspect. But it's really fascinating. I just thank you for making those connections to the work that you're doing right now. With all of this in mind, I'm wondering if you could share where you have seen successful strategies with using an attachment lens or a relational lens and using that type of approach to promote school attendance and connection to school, because we know that connection is really the root of all of this.
And I think, and I know I said this earlier, but one place for us to start is to really move away from envisioning this as compliance, and then when there's not compliance, responding to it punitively. And so one place that I know some schools have found success, in fact, some schools have found remarkable success in the change of attendance is just what I would frame as compassionate communication. So when messaging does go home from a school to caregivers and families, what is that message? And when a kid walks into a school and they're late or they've been absent for days, what is the first message that they hear? When a student hasn't gotten assignments completed because they have been disengaged or absent, or for whatever reason, what is the message that they hear around all that? And that schools are finding out that they see much more improvement when they're responding with that compassionate communication. So there's a few elements to that I think are important. And I know that the rest of you would probably have ideas to add to that as well. One thing is to always start with just that welcome and that sense of belonging. So we are so glad that you're here and you matter to us and you belong here. And we need to figure out how to make sure that our feeling also aligns with how you're feeling about that experience. And then the second piece that I think is so important is just to be curious, to ask questions. If someone hasn't gotten something done, or they have been absent, or they're late, just to express that curiosity, and not just with students when they come in the building, but also with families and caregivers when that communication comes back. So thinking about sort of zero tolerance policies around more than this many absences, and then parents get the letter. What they found through research is actually that makes kids even less likely to come to school. So we have to abandon those old kind of models that we have, and instead, how can we reach out and ask questions about that, and ask questions about if what's been happening that has contributed to the absence, and also as a community of people who are connected and to care about one another, what can we do to help support that? And so coming in alongside caregivers as the experts on their lives and the knower of what their needs are, and saying, what can I do based on knowing that to help support this? I also think families know their kids better than anybody. And so asking about their students' experience at school can give us so much information, because some kids do really well at just faking like everything's fine when it's not, and they're not going to tell anybody at school what's going on, but families might be more likely to do that. And so asking for their help in figuring it out and inviting them in, not just as partners, but also as experts on knowing, and to find out what are we needing to change in our environment, or what can we do to help support your family that's making this hard.
Thank you so much, and just appreciate all that you've offered to this conversation. And one thing I just want to add to, and we did an episode on welcoming routines, so we have that available for those who might be interested. But another episode that we've done is on Indigenous kinship structures and just understanding that better. And so I bring that up because I know you just mentioned, the importance of bringing family in. And so I feel like that's a nice complement to this conversation. But also I feel like it's hard to talk about attendance and potential strategies without also talking about a something that we posed in that kinship episode around the importance of creating policies around cultural leave, because we know from our work with students and families, they often describe a hard time with maintaining or meeting the attendance expectations, because there is counter expectations for them as members of a family and members as a community, to be present for culturally related activities. And so I just thank you for all the connections you're making, and a lot is resonating right now. So thank you very much.
And Michelle, that reminds me too of going back to your talking about worldview. When you have worldviews that have different sets of values, how confusing and hard that is for kids, and especially to know when their attachments have been created in one worldview. They can't just jump into a new way of being. So how do we have the worldview of the school align with the worldview of their original attachments?
Absolutely. And that actually just leads me, just the other day, we were having a conversation with other OPI employees, and I was doing my best. I'm actually excited about this episode for many reasons, but I feel like this episode has done a better job than I did yesterday when we were talking about how the language and culture work that our Crystal and I's colleague does is really, we see that as an attendance initiative. We see that as we can blend worldviews, as we can create learning spaces that are more reflective of the student's home environment, that is a school attendance intervention, so to speak, and really, being more clear about that. And so again, just thank you for these points you're making and bringing up. But thank you. And
thank you so much for the work that y'all do as well, right? It takes all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And
well, thank you for having us and for creating this format. I know this came out of the creativity of your minds, like what's another way to get the message out? And I think this is a powerful way to do that. And I've enjoyed listening to your episode. So thank you for just giving us the opportunity to come share more about attachment and attendance and about CAPE.
Wonderful. And thank you, all of you, for listening. And we will look forward to connecting with everyone again on a future episode. So thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Creating Conditions podcast from the American Indian Student Achievement Team at OPI. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, share, and leave a review. And keep joining us as we work to create the conditions every student needs to thrive.